Jen Burch, a former molecular biologist, is a reading remediation specialist for the Dyslexia Resource at the Schenck School in Atlanta, Georgia, working to remediate students in an underserved public school in Atlanta. Rosemarie DeJarnett is a professor of reading and literacy at Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida. Dr. Dennis Eastman is Director of Secondary Education at Biola University in La Mirada, California, a former high school principal and the father of 5 children who have learning needs, including 3 with severe dyslexia. And last but not least, Dr. Nicole Tetreault is a neuroscientist who specializes in neurodevelopment and neurodegenerative disorders. She's the author of Insight into a Bright Mind, a neuroscientist's personal stories of unique thinking. Well, let's start this conversation with Jen. I imagine that parents often assume that teachers are equipped to handle whatever comes their way. But in general, are most educational professionals trained to accurately identify and support dyslexic learners?
So I think teachers nowadays have a lot to be responsible for. Unfortunately, most pre-service training programs don't provide for any instruction in dyslexia or language-based learning disorders. I think that there's a lot of myths and misconceptions out there that parents really have to be aware of, and then teach their teachers that, you know, it's not a vision problem. It's not seeing things backwards. It has to do with, you know, how a student is hearing the sounds in the language and being able to manipulate those sounds.
Thank you, Jen. Rosemarie, is it important for parents to establish a foundation for reading when they're dealing with kids who have dyslexia?
Absolutely. So the parent's attitude really sets the tone for their student who's going to be kind of navigating their classroom. And so I always like to explain to parents that dyslexia does not just impact a child's reading, how they're looking at the letters in their texts or their novels, that it impacts their comprehension, their grammar, their spoken language. And so it's important that parents can find and recognize their child's strengths. For instance, their spatial reasoning, their creativity, and bring those strengths out while working with some of those areas that might be a challenge. But definitely their attitude towards their child with dyslexia is going to help their child work through that and set the tone.
Thank you, Rosemarie. Dr. Eastman, how important is it for parents to work out their own issues about dyslexia and any feelings that they may have that are related to deep-seated beliefs that dyslexia is more disabling than enabling, so that they can be calm and empathetic with their children?
Well, the critical factor really here is that parents and guardians recognize that their personal experience with dyslexia is their personal experience with dyslexia. It's not necessarily the same one that their child will be experiencing. My wife and I have 6 children, 5 of which have learning needs and 3 have severe dyslexia, and it looks different in all of them. And yet I didn't suffer from dyslexia, nor did my wife. And what we've discovered is that our children have other significant strengths that have come out that have not necessarily been in the area of reading and necessarily lots and lots of memorization, but a lot of other manners and means that we've been able to celebrate with them. So the invisibility of these learning needs, which only seems to appear when text or a piece of paper is in front of them, actually disappears when they're doing other things. And while reading and writing is critical, we've found ways in which we can help build ramps instead of constantly making them take the stairs regarding reading and writing.
Now to you, Dr. Tetreault. How important is it for parents to empower kids with information about dyslexia rather than pretending that the differences don't exist or downplaying them?
Well, it's really critical for them to understand that their way of experiencing the world is unique to them. And when we really shift the awareness from a deficit-based model to a strength-based model, children really can learn great skills for self-advocacy and self-determination. And that's really critical when you're thinking about putting the foot forward of saying, look, I'm a great spatial reasoner. I'm really good at being able to have episodic memory. I may need some supports here, like I need audiobooks, or I may need a note taker. And so it's really critical that we shift the awareness to where it creates a positive mind state and they can see their real strengths within their different types of brain wiring and navigating in the world.
Thank you very much for that, Doctor. Now, Jen, I've heard this term tossed about a lot, and I'm not sure what it is. So what is a dyslexia profile, and why is it important for empowering a child with dyslexia?
So when I think of a dyslexia profile, I think of, I refer the parents to the International Dyslexia Association definition of dyslexia. And I think it's important for kids to break apart that definition and to understand it, that it's not something that is their fault or that they're stupid or dumb, or I think that they internalize a lot of those things. But by bringing apart the knowledge, it gives them power. And so the definition is that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. So it's important for them to know that it is about their brain and how their brain works. And it works a little bit differently than maybe your friend in your classes. And then it's characterized by difficult with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding. And it's not in how they see things, it's in the phonological component, how they can parse apart language and words in general. And it has nothing to do with how smart they are. And so it's important for them to know those things to empower them, that I can learn and I can do great things despite this problem I have with reading.
All right. Thank you, Jen. Rosemarie, I learned to read using phonics years and years ago. I won't tell you how old I am, but that method seems to be devalued in schools today. But can using the phonic alphabet be a critical tool for helping people with dyslexia grasp reading?
So you are right. It is a hot debate topic right now, both in teacher training programs as well as in every classroom. And what we have found is it would be wonderful if there was one magical tool that you could just use that impacted all readers in the same exact way, but that does not exist. What we do know through the International Dyslexia Association and the What Works Clearinghouse is students need structured literacy with explicit instruction. And that does include phonological awareness and phonics, but it also needs to include multisensory resources. It needs to include universal design. So while that traditional phonics piece is still a part of the program, it does need to be multifaceted. It needs to focus on the student's individual skill strength. And we do that through diagnostics that help teachers be able to drive their instruction in the right way. The underlying piece that we need to always remember is that that curriculum also needs to foster a positive attitude and self-esteem, because in the classroom, we sometimes see that our students who have dyslexia have low self-esteem. Every time they're presented with a reading or writing challenge, they're they're made to feel like they are less than other students. And so we really need to develop that curriculum in our classrooms where it is a curriculum that takes all of those students into consideration, which is really best practices all around.
Thank you, Rose. That's a very important point. Dr. Eastman, speaking of developing, how important is it for parents to help their dyslexic children develop a better working memory?
Well, working memory is like the desktop on your computer. It allows us to grab pieces of information very quickly. And if you saw my desktop right now, you go, it's a wonder you can do anything. But the fact is, many students access this in different ways: visual, auditory, kinesthetic. It's not always through, as was mentioned, a semantic form. Sometimes it's episodic. It's in context. And so working memory has a number of access points that we have to identify our students' strengths and then assist them in going about accessing working memory through these channels. So students with dyslexia who are aware of their strengths can hugely benefit and actually see a great deal of growth in this area. However, they also need intensive and targeted educational intervention in their school experience.
Are there things that parents can do at home to help bolster their memory?
Well, they can, including things like chunking pieces of information, providing written instructions, reducing complex procedures down into much more doable chunks. And then, of course, visual organizers don't always rely on the oral instruction. One of my sons, we actually discovered that if I gave him multiple instructions in a row, that might sound something like, I need you to go to your room, get your backpack, get your cleats, meet me in the car. Well, I'm sitting in the car for 5 minutes and I'm wondering where this person is. I turn off the car, I go in the house, he's standing in his room, and I say, what are you doing? And he says, what is it that you needed me to do? Well, his specialist shared with us, we gave him too many things and then left him to go do it. Now, this has nothing to do with intelligence. He was processing these things, and he somehow, some way, didn't get the whole list by the time he knew he had to go to his room, and he had his cleats in his hand. That's about it. So we worked to have a system set up to help him not only in school, but also getting ready for school. As it was mentioned earlier, this impacts a number of different areas. You don't get to just turn off working memory challenges because you're not sitting in a classroom.
Thank you, Dr. Eastman. Dr. Tetreault, how important is it for parents to allow a child with dyslexia to explore his or her passions and curiosities?
Well, really, curiosity is the heart of developing a well-nourished self-image and self-esteem. And so kids that are tend to be dyslexic are highly imaginative. And being in your imagination network is very different than being in your to-do executive functioning network, which we are just kind of talking about with working memory. And so kids that are in that flow state, for example, and they are allowed to access that imagination, they get this rapid increase of dopamine, they get positive reward, and they also may need time to like transition from that high level engagement to the next activity. So kind of like what we were talking about in the last piece is that you need to give children transitions when you're going from a very highly creative task to a more pragmatic task. And, you know, we also know that when you're in your imagination, that's kind of your highest form of tapping into your individual essence. And so providing space for kids to really have that creative play and that creative time is really important for their natural development.
Thank you so much for that, Doctor. So Jen, how can parents, guardians as well, help children with dyslexia believe in their own strengths and abilities?
I think it's important to start with, you know, it's not just you. When my child was diagnosed with dyslexia, I know she felt like she was the only one in her class. But now we know that, you know, up to 1 in 5 students in their class is going to have dyslexia or some other language-based learning disability. So letting them know that they aren't the only one. Also, by recognizing people that are successful and that are famous for their creativity and their business prowess, that they've been successful in this world and they have dyslexia. So you can do all these things even though you have this learning issue. that helps them believe in their own strengths, because they're like, wow, look at this, what this person did. They still have dyslexia. I have dyslexia. And so I can be just as creative and successful. So I think it's making those connections.
Thank you, Jen. Rose, how important is it for parents to find a way, any way, for their child to be successful?
Well, I don't think it's just up to the parents. I think that it requires a lot of teamwork between the school and the teachers and the parents, kind of all working together to find those resources. So for instance, in my college classroom at Beacon, we really want our students to understand that there is strength in using your resources. So using audio text, speech to text, covered overlays, any of the resources that they have at their access, that is actually a strength. It helps students and their child be able to really demonstrate what they can do. And so we don't want children to think that, oh, I have to use audio text, so I'm not really reading. Reading is using audio text. And so I think for parents to model that at home, to show them that you use audio text and that others use audio text, or voice memos to help them remember that list of things they might need to do. To explain even our calendars are a piece of technology that helps us with our executive functioning. And so not only, do I think it's important to work as a team, I also think parents have the burden of that emotional support, helping their children develop that resilience and those tools to manage. And again, just like has been repeated across the panel, really just helping the child understand they're not the only one that is experiencing this, that there are others that share these same challenges. And again, just working together as a team, letting your child see, that you're bringing in some of those pieces from their classroom, that you're supporting that. Also sharing what you're noticing is working with your child at home with the teachers and support staff at the school, so that they can implement, if you're finding something at home that's working well, that should also be something that is implemented within the classroom, so that builds that consistency.
I love that spirit of collaboration, Rose. Thank you for that. Dr. Eastman, as a parent, it can be tough when you're dealing with a child who has these kind of issues, and you're teaching them something and you think they got it down, and then maybe a couple of days later, wait a minute, they don't remember any of this stuff we just gone over. But should a parent see it as a defeat or a retreat when they have to go back to the basics with a child who has dyslexia, reteaching them phonics or other basics?
Such a good question. I think the critical element in this equation is becoming a student of your student and recognizing, is there something I am doing to prevent my student from being a more effective learner? As a matter of fact, we were kind of given a head fake with one of my kids because he had memorized all 50 states and their capitals, and a scripture that contained 20 verses, and performed it in front of 200 people. And we're sitting there, crying, this is beautiful, this is wonderful. And then when my wife put a letter in front of him, it's time to learn the alphabet. It's time to learn how to read. He was 5 at the time. She puts a letter in front of him, and he kind of screws up his face and guesses. Well, the letter on the card was the first letter of his name. And we thought he was playing around. We thought he was just cracking, you're cracking wise, quit messing around. It's time to, we're reading. And no kidding, that kind of became a daily. This boy does not know his alphabet. And it turned out that he had severe dyslexia. And we went to a specialist, and we had to learn how he learned best. And so it started really with us becoming a student of our student, and then creating a foundation for learning. And as these panelists have so wisely said, strengths-based, be adaptable, recognize that, I said this earlier, You can't stand at the top of the stairs and yell at your child to climb the stairs when, in fact, they can't climb the stairs, but you are insisting that they take the stairs. How about building a ramp? We've got to start at a foundation, and we may have to revisit that foundation for quite some time. And this was the case with our own students in our own family. We had to reteach and repeat and reteach and repeat. And some of it was readiness level, and some of it was they just were not getting this. So we had to change our modality. We had to change what we're doing so they could process. So I would say it does take patience, serious patience, and it can feel like defeat. But let's rejoice in the little victories. He went from knowing his letters to a word to reading a sentence. And boy, that day was just huge. Where do you want to go for dinner? I mean, it was such a big day for us, but it was a super important step.
Thank you very much for that and your personal observation, Dr. Eastman. Dr. Tetreault, can you tell us what a growth mindset is and why parents should model that for their dyslexic child?
Yeah, so I think Dr. Eastman just presented what a growth mindset is the adaptability to change and to be open to really learning from challenges and difficulties and having that resilience muscle be built. And what's really important when we think about dyslexic kids and adults is that there's quite a bit of brilliance and overcompensation that happens. To think about a child memorizing an entire scripture, memorizing 50 states, and having all of that information, but doing it basically auditorily and not doing it visually takes a lot of brain power and a lot of massive skill. And so when that child can learn word by word, letter by letter to read, that is that growth mindset. And it's really everything when you think about creative solutions and flexible thinking. The more of a growth mindset, you have that flexible thinking, you have that intellectual curiosity. How can I rise up from this challenge? How can I, create new skill sets? What can I do better? And that is like the major piece. And for learning to happen in a growth mindset stage, there needs to be safety. And that safety needs to come in with emotional, positive supports that are inclusive, that are in the home with parents and in the community. And when a child feels safe, they're able to express that, creative and flexible thinking to move to the next stage. If you have a child who's stressed out, they're going to shut down and be resistant to growth. And so it's really important that safety is at the core to enable that growth mindset to happen.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Tetreault. And I'm going to close our conversation today with kind of a lightning round here. So if you wouldn't mind, each of you sharing one strategy or one thing that you would like parents to remember who are raising a dyslexic child to help improve the situation in their household. And I think we'll start with Jen. What do you think, Jen?
Speaking of Dr. Tetreault and the growth mindset, I think it is important to let our kids know, our dyslexic kids, that it's okay to make mistakes, that we grow from our mistakes, that everything doesn't need to be perfect, because we don't learn from our perfection. We learn from, making those mistakes, challenging ourselves, and that's okay. We don't need to shut down when we make a mistake. We need to learn from it.
Thank you, Jen. Your turn, Rose.
So I think one of the biggest things is just to provide that support and model reading and writing, and have it be a positive experience, even with those mistakes, even with that challenge. Build that ramp so that your child can see that positive experience and modeling.
Thank you, Rose. Dr. Eastman.
I would offer maybe a different form of the 3 R's, and it would be a synopsis of what these experts are saying. Let's begin with relationship. Be supportive that matters. Is this a mistake-friendly place? Then relevance, put the content in context when you can. It matters. Just reading these words that mean nothing, maybe find an area of interest for the students so they really do want to know about it. And then your third R, rigor. And you start looking then for a bit more correction and getting them on a much more grammatically correct track. And I think when you go in that order, you'll find success is nearby.
Thank you, Dr. Eastman. And Dr. Tetreault, bring us home.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it all comes down to compassion. When you can model compassion for the struggles, when you can model positive supports, and when you could really give the child the insight to have compassion for themselves when they're making a mistake or when they get something right, that, that when they can soften and realize that, this is part of their human experience, their brain wiring and their story, that when you have that compassion, it really boosts being connected with people and in community, and really allows a child to thrive and changes a more positive mind state and positive emotions about their struggles.
Well, thank you. Jen Burch, Rosemarie DeJarnett, Dr. Dennis Eastman, and Dr. Nicole Tetreault. Thanks for the knowledge.